Mayor Solomon Greer was face down on the hot pavement outside Alden Creek City Hall, his wrists locked in handcuffs. A white police officer kneeled on his back while hundreds of people who had just been applauding his speech stood frozen, cell phones raised. His wife, Josephine, screamed from the crowd. His 12-year-old daughter, Harmony, watched from the front row, her mouth open but silent. The officer called him a suspect. But 60 seconds ago, Solomon was the most powerful man in this city. What happened between the applause and the asphalt would change Alden Creek forever. And within 1 hour, someone would lose their badge. 6 hours earlier, Solomon Greer stood in his bathroom mirror adjusting his tie. The fabric was deep navy, the knot tight and centered, and the face staring back at him carried the kind of weight that no amount of sleep could erase. He was 44 years old, and in 8 months as the first black mayor of Alden Creek, Georgia, he had aged what felt like a decade. The lines around his eyes had deepened. The gray along his temples had spread. But his jaw was set, and his eyes were steady, and he told himself what he told himself every morning before walking out the door. Today matters. Every single day in this office matters. His wife Josephine appeared in the doorway behind him, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed and a soft expression on her face. She was 41, a public school administrator who had spent her career fighting for resources in underfunded classrooms, and she knew what it looked like when a man was carrying more than he should. She told him to enjoy today, not just survive it, enjoy it. Their daughter Harmony came bounding down the hallway, 12 years old, and buzzing with energy, asking if she could sit in the front row during his speech. Solomon smiled for the first time that morning and told her the front row was already saved. The drive to City Hall took 11 minutes. Solomon used every one of them to think about the road that had brought him here. He had spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney handling police misconduct cases across the state of Georgia. He had seen families destroyed by false arrests, by planted evidence by officers who treated black neighborhoods like occupied territory. He had won cases and lost cases, but the case that changed everything happened right here in Alden Creek. 3 years ago, an unarmed black teenager named Terrence was pulled over for a broken taillight on Madison Avenue. Within 90 seconds, he was face down on the pavement with 50,000 volts running through his body from a taser pressed against his ribs. The dashcam footage went viral. The officer was placed on paid administrative leave for 6 weeks and returned to full duty without so much as a written reprimand. Solomon watched that footage 17 times. On the 18th viewing, he decided to run for mayor. He won by 412 votes against a white candidate backed by every power structure in the city. The margin was razor thin, but the message was seismic. Alden Creek, a mid-sized southern city of roughly 68,000 people, where racial tensions ran deep beneath a polished surface of so-called progress, had elected its first black mayor. And Solomon had spent every day since pushing for the reforms that had made him the most hated man inside the Alden Creek Police Department. Body cameras for every officer. A civilian oversight board with real authority. An independent review of every use of force complaint filed in the past 10 years. Each reform was a declaration of war against the way things had always been done, and the men who had always done them knew it. Across town, in a quiet residential street lined with oak trees, Officer Wade Kirkland sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car parked outside the house where he grew up. He was 41 years old, white, a 12-year veteran of the department, and every cell in his body vibrated with a hatred so deep it had become indistinguishable from identity. He stared at a framed photograph propped on the dashboard. Captain Virgil Kirkland, his father in full dress uniform, jaw, squared chest, decorated eyes like iron. Virgil had run the Alden Creek Police Department for 30 years. He built it from nothing. He made it powerful. He made it feared. And now a black man with a law degree and a thin mandate was tearing it apart piece by piece. Wade had 9 excessive force complaints on his record. Every single one filed by a black resident. Every single one dismissed. He considered those dismissals proof that the system worked. He considered the complaints proof that certain people would never respect authority. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. When the voice answered, Wade spoke 5 words. It is set for today. The Founders' Day celebration began at noon. City Hall Plaza filled with families, local business owners, church groups, school children, and community leaders from every corner of Alden Creek. A stage had been erected at the top of the plaza steps, draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Solomon took the podium at 12:15. He spoke about progress. He spoke about accountability. He spoke about building a city where every citizen, regardless of the color of their skin, could trust the officers sworn to protect them. The crowd applauded. Josephine watched from the 3rd row, her hand on Harmony's shoulder. Nora Poindexter, city council member, and Solomon's strongest ally, stood near the side of the stage, nodding along. Reverend Theodore Chambliss, 63 years old, pastor of Greater Hope Baptist Church, and Solomon's mentor for over 20 years, sat in a folding chair near the front, his Bible resting on his knee. Solomon was mid-sentence when the first ripple moved through the crowd. People near the back began turning their heads. A uniformed officer was pushing through the crowd, moving with deliberate, aggressive strides toward the stage. Wade Kirkland reached the base of the steps and stopped. He looked up at Solomon and spoke in a voice loud enough for half the plaza to hear. He announced that the mayor matched the description of an armed robbery suspect from that morning and ordered him to step down from the podium immediately. Solomon's hands tightened on the edges of the lectern. He kept his voice level and asked Kirkland what he was doing. Kirkland did not answer. He climbed the steps, grabbed Solomon by the arm, spun him around, and forced him face down onto the stage. The microphone hit the floor with a shriek of feedback. Kirkland drove his knee into the mayor's back, wrenched his arms behind him, and locked the handcuffs around his wrists with 2 sharp clicks. Then, in a movement hidden by his own body, as he leaned over the mayor, Kirkland slipped a small sealed bag of methamphetamine into the inside pocket of Solomon's suit jacket. Nobody in the crowd saw it. But every phone in the plaza captured the image of the first black mayor of Alden Creek, face down on the pavement, a white officer's knee pressed into his spine. And within minutes that image would be seen by millions. The plaza erupted into chaos. Voices crashed into each other from every direction, some screaming in outrage, some shouting for someone to call anybody, as if the structures designed to help were not the very ones committing the act. Josephine shoved through the crowd with a force that surprised even her voice tearing from her throat as she called Solomon's name over and over again. A stranger held Harmony back, wrapping arms around the 12-year-old girl who was shaking so violently her teeth chattered, despite the 90-degree Georgia heat. Cell phones were raised everywhere, hundreds of them, glowing rectangles aimed at the stage like a congregation of witnesses. The videos hit social media within seconds. Within 5 minutes, the first clips had been shared thousands of times. Within 15 minutes, the hashtag was trending nationally. Solomon lay on the stage with the side of his face pressed against the wood, his hands locked behind his back, and his mind cycling through a single thought: this is not happening. But it was happening. He could feel the heat of the wood beneath his cheek. He could feel the weight of Kirkland's knee pressing between his shoulder blades. He could hear his wife screaming. He could see at the edge of his vision the small face of his daughter disappearing into the crowd. It was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. An unmarked black sedan pulled up to the edge of the plaza 12 minutes after the handcuffs clicked shut. Police Chief Conrad Lassiter stepped out, straightening his tie as he walked through the crowd. He was 57 years old, silver-haired, square-jawed, and built like a man who had spent his career perfecting the appearance of authority without ever questioning the corruption it concealed. He pushed through the crowd with calm, measured steps, his face arranged in an expression of shock and concern that he had rehearsed in his rearview mirror on the drive over. He climbed the stage. He looked at Kirkland. He looked at Solomon on the ground. He turned to the cameras which were everywhere, now local news crews having arrived within minutes, and he spoke in a voice loud enough for every microphone to catch. He declared that this was unacceptable. He ordered Kirkland to uncuff the mayor immediately, but Kirkland did not move immediately. Instead, he reached into Solomon's jacket pocket and produced the small sealed bag he had planted moments earlier. He held it up, turning it slowly so the cameras could capture it from every angle. He announced to the crowd and to the press that during the course of the lawful detention, he had discovered narcotics on the mayor's person. The crowd gasped. Reporters surged forward. Lassiter, calculating the political optics with the speed of a man who had survived 30 years in a corrupt institution, made his move. He stepped forward, looked directly into the nearest camera, and stripped Kirkland of his badge. He removed it from his chest with a single sharp motion. He ordered Kirkland to hand over his service weapon. Kirkland complied, his face a mask of rehearsed defiance. Lassiter declared an immediate investigation. He announced that Officer Kirkland was suspended effective immediately and that the department would hold itself accountable. The crowd roared in approval. People clapped. Some cheered. The cameras captured every frame of the chief's performance. And it was a performance, every word, every gesture, every expression calibrated for the screen. But the damage was done. Solomon was uncuffed and helped to his feet by two officers he did not recognize. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder. His lip was split where his face had struck the stage floor. His wrists were red and raw. And the question of the drugs now hung over him like a sentence already pronounced. Reporters shouted questions at him as he was escorted off the stage. Mayor Greer. Can you explain the narcotics, Mayor Greer? Do you have a substance abuse problem? Mayor Greer, will you resign? He had no answers because he had no explanation. The drugs were planted. He knew that in his bones. But he did not yet know how or by whom or why the evidence bag looked exactly like the ones used by the department's evidence room. He knew only that an hour ago he was standing at a podium talking about the future, and now he was bleeding and humiliated, and the most powerful image in the country was his face pressed against the floor of his own City Hall stage. The Greer home was silent that evening, in a way that felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the rooms. Josephine sat on the couch, holding Harmony, who had not spoken a single word since the plaza. The girl's eyes were open, but vacant, fixed on a point on the wall that held nothing, as if she had found a place inside herself where the world could not reach her. Solomon sat alone in his study with the door closed. His torn jacket hung on the back of his chair. His phone buzzed continuously on the desk, call after call from his attorney, from reporters from political allies, whose voices carried the unmistakable tone of people already preparing to distance themselves. He did not answer. He sat in the leather chair his wife had given him when he won the election, and he stared at the wall, and he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The weight of the knee, the click of the handcuffs, the sound of his daughter's silence. Across town in a small apartment above a dry cleaner on 8th Street, Kennedy Ferris was not sleeping. She was 29 years old, African-American, an investigative reporter for the Alden Creek Herald, and she had been digging into the Alden Creek Police Department for 7 months. She had sources, she had documents, and she had a hunch that would not let her rest. She pulled up the photograph that every news outlet in the country was running the image of Kirkland holding up the evidence bag. She zoomed in. She studied the markings on the bag. Then she accessed the department's publicly available evidence logs, which Solomon's own transparency reforms had made searchable online for the first time in the city's history. She cross-referenced the batch and lot numbers visible on the bag in the photograph against every drug seizure logged in the past 12 months. The match came back at 2:14 in the morning. The methamphetamine found on Mayor Solomon Greer had been seized 7 months earlier during a routine traffic stop. The seizing officer listed on the evidence log was badge number 471. Officer Wade Kirkland. The drugs that were planted on the mayor had been stolen from the department's own evidence room by the very officer who claimed to have found them. Kennedy Ferris sat back in her chair, her heart hammering, and whispered a single word to the empty room. She said, "Got you." Kennedy Ferris did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, and 3 notebooks spread around her like the borders of a small paper fortress, and she pulled records until the sun came through the blinds. She was methodical. She was relentless. She had learned investigative journalism from an editor who told her that the difference between a good reporter and a great one was the willingness to sit with boring documents until they confessed their secrets. And these documents were confessing. She started with the evidence log for the methamphetamine that had been planted on Solomon. That led her to the chain of custody records for every drug seizure processed through the Alden Creek evidence room over the past 5 years. She cross-referenced sign-in sheets, transfer documents, and disposal records. Patterns emerged like bones surfacing from shallow graves. Over a 60-month period, narcotics with a combined street value exceeding $700,000 had simply vanished from the evidence room. Cash seized during arrests totaling another $320,000 had been logged in, but never logged out, never deposited into the city's forfeiture account, never accounted for in any audit. Weapons seized during investigations had disappeared. 14 handguns, 2 shotguns, 1 assault rifle, all logged in, all gone. Every missing item traced back to a small cluster of officers who had rotated through evidence room duty over the 5-year period. Wade Kirkland's name appeared more frequently than any other. But he was not alone. 6 other officers appeared on the rotation logs during the periods when items went missing. The corruption was not one man. It was a crew. While Kennedy worked through the night, Solomon Greer sat in a wooden pew inside Greater Hope Baptist Church, the only place in Alden Creek where he felt the walls were not listening. Reverend Theodore Chambliss sat beside him. The church was empty, except for the 2 of them. The overhead lights turned off only the glow of the exit signs, and the faint amber of the streetlights filtering through stained glass, casting any illumination. Chambliss was 63 years old, and had pastored this church for 31 years. He had marched in his 20s, been arrested in his 30s, buried men destroyed by the system in his 40s, and learned in his 50s that the fight never ended. It only changed shape. He listened as Solomon talked. The mayor's voice was low and flat, emptied of the confidence that had carried him to office. He told Chambliss that he did not understand how Kirkland could be so brazen, how a police officer could assault and frame the sitting mayor of a city in broad daylight, in front of cameras, and feel confident that he would get away with it. Chambliss was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. He told Solomon that Kirkland was not acting alone, and that men like Kirkland never act alone. Men like Kirkland are the visible edge of a system that operates in the dark. They are the hand that strikes, but they are not the brain that decides when and where to strike. If Wade Kirkland felt bold enough to handcuff the mayor of Alden Creek on the steps of City Hall in front of the entire city, it was because he knew with absolute certainty that the system behind him would protect him. Chambliss told Solomon to stop thinking about Kirkland and start thinking about who gave Kirkland permission. Across town, the Alden Creek Police Union held a press conference at 9 the following morning. The union president stood behind a podium decorated with the department's seal and delivered a statement that was part legal argument and part threat. He called Wade Kirkland a dedicated officer who followed established protocol in detaining a suspect matching the description of an active robbery case. He called the discovery of narcotics on the mayor's person deeply troubling. He demanded that Solomon Greer resign immediately, citing the drug discovery as evidence of moral failure and unfitness for office. He called Chief Lassiter's decision to strip Kirkland's badge premature and politically motivated. The statement was carried live by 3 local television stations and picked up by 2 national cable networks. Within 48 hours, a recall petition began circulating through the predominantly white neighborhoods on the north side of Alden Creek. It gathered 3,000 signatures in 2 days. The signatures arrived bundled in neat stacks at the city clerk's office, organized by precinct, alphabetized, and printed on matching paper. It was not a grassroots movement. It was a coordinated operation designed to look like one. City Council member Nora Poindexter held her own press conference the following day, standing on the steps of City Hall, in the exact spot where Solomon had been handcuffed. She was 51 years old, African American, a former teacher, and she had a voice that could fill a room without a microphone. She called the handcuffing a racially motivated attack on a duly elected public official. She called the drug discovery a transparent frame job. She called for a federal investigation. She became an immediate target. That night, her office phone rang 37 times between 8 in the evening and midnight. The calls contained threats so specific and so vile that her assistant quit the following morning. When Nora walked to her car the next day, she found all 4 tires slashed and a note tucked under her windshield wiper that contained a single racial slur and the word "next." Solomon Chambliss and Nora began meeting privately, pooling information, and using public records to trace the lines of corruption. They worked from the church, from Nora's living room, from the back booth of a diner on the south side of town, where nobody from the power structure ever ate. They filed open records requests. They studied department budgets. They interviewed retired officers who had left the department under suspicious circumstances. What they found was staggering. The group of corrupt officers had been running a full-scale protection racket targeting exclusively the black neighborhoods and black-owned businesses of Alden Creek for over 15 years. Barbershops, restaurants, convenience stores, hair salons, auto repair shops, and small groceries. Groceries in the black community had been forced to pay monthly fees ranging from $100 to $500 to avoid fabricated code violations, health citations, fire safety shutdowns, and targeted arrests. Residents who complained were arrested on charges that materialized out of thin air: drug possession, trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. The charges were always dropped or dismissed, but only after the accused had spent days in jail, lost wages, and endured the humiliation and fear that was the true punishment. And the entire operation, every shakedown, every fabricated arrest, every dollar extracted from the black community, had been designed, built, and launched by the late Captain Virgil Kirkland, Wade's father. The man in the photograph on the dashboard. The captain who ran the department for 30 years had used his authority to construct a machine of racial exploitation that operated in plain sight, protected by the badge, funded by the suffering of black families, and inherited by his son, like a family business passed from one generation to the next. The retaliation came fast, and it came without subtlety, as if the men behind it wanted Solomon to know exactly who was responsible and exactly how powerless he was to stop them. At 3:17 in the morning on a Wednesday, a sound like a cannon shot ripped through the Greer family's quiet residential street. Solomon was out of bed and at the window in 4 seconds. His car parked in the driveway was engulfed in flames. The fire climbed 20 feet into the air, throwing orange light across the front of the house, across the lawn, across the face of his neighbor, who stood on the opposite sidewalk in his bathrobe, with his hand over his mouth. Josephine grabbed Harmony and pulled her into the hallway. The girl screamed from behind her mother's body, her voice high and thin and breaking. Solomon called 911. The fire department arrived in 14 minutes. The police arrived in 22. In a city where average response time for the police was 7 minutes. It took them 22 minutes to reach the home of the sitting mayor. No evidence was recovered from the scene. No suspects were identified. No arrests were made. The incident report listed the cause as undetermined. 2 days later, Josephine began receiving text messages from numbers she did not recognize. The first message arrived at 6:43 in the morning while she was making breakfast. It contained a racial slur and a detailed description of the route she drove to work every day, including the exact intersection where she turned left onto Magnolia Boulevard and the name of the gas station where she sometimes stopped for coffee. The second message arrived at noon. It described what Harmony was wearing at school that day: blue backpack, white sneakers, hair in 2 braids. Someone was watching their daughter. Josephine locked herself in the bathroom and vomited. She did not tell Solomon about the messages for 2 days, because she could see that the weight he was carrying was already bending him toward a breaking point, and she was afraid that this would be the thing that snapped him in half. Nora Poindexter's home was broken into on a Thursday evening while she was attending a city council budget meeting. The intruders did not take her television, her laptop, her jewelry, or the $300 in cash sitting in a drawer in her bedroom. They took her files. Every document she had compiled over the past 7 months related to police misconduct, complaints, internal affairs, records officer rotation schedules, and financial discrepancies in the department budget. Hard copies, USB drives, backup disks. Everything was gone. Every copy. Every record. Months of work erased in a single evening by men who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. Reverend Chambliss's church received a phoned-in bomb threat at 9:20 on a Sunday morning, 40 minutes into the worship service. 300 congregants, many of them elderly, some using walkers and wheelchairs, were evacuated into the parking lot in the September heat. Children cried. An 86-year-old woman named Estelle collapsed from heat exhaustion and was taken to the hospital by ambulance. The bomb squad spent 4 hours searching the building. No device was found. The threat was a weapon of disruption designed not to kill, but to terrorize, to remind the congregation and their pastor that their faith and their community and their safety meant nothing to the men who controlled this city. A rally materialized outside City Hall the following Monday. 50 people carried signs that read, "Resign now," and "Drug Mayor must go," and "Alden Creek deserves better." Local television covered it as a spontaneous expression of community outrage. But Solomon's allies traced the organization of the rally to a political action committee funded by 3 local business owners whose names appeared repeatedly in the financial records connected to the protection racket. The signs were professionally printed. The participants were transported from 2 neighboring counties by chartered bus. The outrage was manufactured, purchased, and delivered on schedule. The isolation began to close around Solomon, like walls moving inward. Political allies who had stood with him during the campaign began going quiet. Phone calls went to voicemail. Text messages received no response. A city council member who had publicly supported Solomon's police reforms issued a statement calling for calm and patience and urging all parties to allow the investigation to proceed. It was the political equivalent of stepping away from a man on fire. Solomon felt it. He felt the distance growing, felt the silence expanding, felt the machinery of the city grinding around him like gears designed to crush anyone who tried to reach inside and change the mechanism. He was fighting an enemy. He could see Wade Kirkland, and an enemy he could not see the invisible architecture of power that had kept this city running the same way for generations. Then a single document changed everything. Through a source inside City Hall, whose identity Solomon protected with his life, he obtained a leaked internal memorandum written by Police Chief Conrad Lassiter. The memo was addressed to 3 senior officers and was dated 4 days after the handcuffing incident. In cold, precise language, Lassiter instructed the officers to ensure that all evidence related to the narcotics found on Mayor Greer was preserved and forwarded to the district attorney's office for prosecution. He instructed them to block any internal investigation into the evidence room's chain of custody records. He ordered them to compile a file of the mayor's daily schedule, including his movements meetings and personal appointments, and to share that file with Officer Kirkland through a designated intermediary. The man who had stripped Kirkland's badge on camera, who had declared accountability to the press, who had played the role of the righteous chief holding his department to a higher standard, was the architect of the entire operation. Lassiter's dramatic public display had been theater. Behind the curtain, he was the director, the producer, and the most dangerous actor on the stage. The man Solomon had believed was his only ally inside law enforcement was the one holding the knife behind his back, and he had been holding it from the very beginning. Solomon sat in the basement of Greater Hope Baptist Church at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and stared at the memorandum spread on the folding table in front of him. And he understood with perfect clarity that he was completely alone within the power structure of Alden Creek. The police chief was compromised. The officers were compromised. The political machinery of the city was turning against him with the coordinated precision of an engine that had been running long before he took office and was designed to keep running long after he was gone. He could not go to local law enforcement because local law enforcement was the enemy. He could not trust the local courts because the judges who sat in those courts had been appointed by the same network of families that had controlled this city for generations. He could not trust the district attorney because the district attorney's office received its cases from the police department and its political support from the same donors who funded the recall petition. Every door was closed. Every road led back to the same men. Solomon picked up a prepaid phone he had purchased that afternoon from a gas station 40 miles outside the city and called a former law school colleague who worked in the Georgia State Attorney General's office. He spoke for 11 minutes. He explained the situation in precise clinical terms, the way he had been trained to present cases during his years as a civil rights attorney. His colleague listened without interrupting. When Solomon finished, there was a pause. His colleague told him that what he was describing, if it could be proven, was not a local matter. It was federal. And he gave Solomon a name. Raymond Oakes, Department of Justice, Atlanta. While Solomon planned his next move in secret, Wade Kirkland operated in the open with a brazenness that bordered on performance. He had been stripped of his badge, yes, but he wore his uniform jacket around town, as if the badge were still pinned to his chest. He drove his personal truck through the black neighborhoods, slowly windows down thin blue line sticker, prominent on the rear window, his arm resting on the doorframe, like a man surveying property he owned. He showed up at Reverend Chambliss's Sunday service, walking through the front doors of Greater Hope Baptist Church, as if he had been a member for 40 years. He sat in the last pew, arms crossed over his chest, and he stared at Solomon throughout the entire sermon. He did not sing, he did not pray, he did not speak, he did not need to. His presence was the message. I am here, I am watching, and there is nothing you can do about it. The intimidation campaign against the black business community intensified with surgical precision. Restaurants that had hosted fundraisers for Solomon's mayoral campaign received surprise visits from the county health department. Inspectors who had never set foot in those establishments suddenly discovered critical violations that demanded immediate closure. A soul food restaurant on Oak Street that had operated for 23 years without a single citation was shut down for 48 hours over a refrigerator temperature reading that the owner's own thermometer contradicted. A black-owned bookstore that had displayed a "We Support Mayor Greer" sign in its window received a visit from the fire marshal who cited the store for blocked emergency exits. The exits were not blocked. The sign disappeared from the window the next day. Barbershops, hair salons, tax preparation offices, and small groceries across the south side of Alden Creek all received similar visits. Citations piled up. Legal fees mounted. Some businesses closed temporarily. Others removed any sign of political affiliation from their storefronts and windows. The message moved through the black community like a current: support the mayor and pay the price. Keep your head down, and you might survive. It was in this atmosphere of suffocating fear that a young man named Jaden Colson approached Solomon in the parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly grocery store on a Saturday afternoon. Jaden was 22 years old, thin with close-cropped hair, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from living in constant proximity to danger. He ran a small barbershop called Fresh Cuts on the corner of Broad Street and Fifth Avenue in the heart of the Black business district. He had opened it 10 months after graduating from barber school, using a loan co-signed by his grandmother. It was 3 chairs, a waiting bench, a television mounted on the wall, and the smell of aftershave and hope. And for the past 2 years, he had been paying Wade Kirkland's crew $200 a month. The first visit had come 6 weeks after he opened. 2 officers in uniform walked in, looked around, and told Jaden that his business license was not properly displayed. It was displayed. It was framed and hanging on the wall directly behind the front counter. They told him it needed to be within 3 feet of the entrance door, which was not a real regulation. They told him they would be back in a week to check, and they suggested he consider a monthly contribution to the department's Community Partnership Fund. There was no Community Partnership Fund. There was only the envelope Jaden handed to a plainclothes officer on the first of every month, $200 in cash. No receipt, no record, no acknowledgement, except the absence of further harassment. Jaden told Solomon all of this in the parking lot, speaking quickly, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. But then he said something that made Solomon's breath stop in his chest. Jaden told him he had evidence. For the past 8 months, he had hidden a phone behind a row of hair product bottles on the shelf facing the front counter. Every time the officers came to collect, the phone recorded. He had videos of them taking the money. He had audio of them making threats. He had timestamps and dates and faces and badge numbers. And he had one recording that stood above all others. A recording made 3 months ago when Kirkland and another man had parked outside his shop and spoken to each other through the open windows of their vehicles, not knowing that Jaden's phone, propped in the window behind a bottle of Clippers oil, was capturing every word. Solomon asked who the other man was. Jaden described him. Silver hair, square jaw, unmarked sedan. Solomon closed his eyes. It was Lassiter. In the recording, Kirkland's voice was clear and unhurried. He told Lassiter they needed to put this black mayor back in his place. He said no black man should ever hold power over white officers in Alden Creek. He said this city had an order, and that order had been maintained for 100 years, and one election was not going to change it. Lassiter's voice responded equally calm. He agreed. And then he discussed the plan to plant narcotics on the mayor during a public event, describing the method, the timing, and the expected outcome in detail. The racial motivation was stated openly. The conspiracy was laid bare. And all of it was recorded on a 22-year-old barber's hidden phone. The circle was small, and it was tight, and it was bound together by something stronger than strategy. Solomon, Reverend Chambliss, Kennedy Ferris, and Nora Poindexter met in the basement of Greater Hope Baptist Church every night for a week. They communicated only through prepaid phones purchased from gas stations in neighboring counties. They arrived at the church separately, entering through 3 different doors at staggered intervals. They left the same way. Paranoia was not paranoia when the people watching you had already burned your car, threatened your child, and stolen your files. It was common sense. They compiled everything. Kennedy brought her evidence room documentation, the spreadsheets showing 5 years of vanishing drugs, cash, and weapons, all cross-referenced against officer rotation schedules and sign-in logs. Solomon brought the leaked Lassiter memorandum. Nora brought what she had been able to reconstruct of her stolen files from memory and from backup notes she had stored at her sister's house in Savannah. And in the center of the table, charging from a portable battery pack, sat Jaden Colson's phone. They listened to the recordings together. They watched the videos. They organized everything into a single digital file and uploaded it to 3 separate encrypted cloud storage accounts. They made 2 physical copies and stored them in 2 separate locations outside of Alden Creek. They were building a case the way Solomon had been trained to build cases during his years as a civil rights attorney, layer by layer, document by document, fact by fact, until the weight of the evidence was so heavy that no power structure on Earth could hold it up and pretend it did not exist. But the power structure was watching more closely than any of them realized. And it struck before they could deliver the evidence to anyone. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 patrol cars pulled up in front of Freshcut's barbershop on Broad Street. 6 officers entered the shop while Jaden was cutting a customer's hair. They ordered everyone out. They searched the premises. 20 minutes later, they emerged carrying 2 sealed evidence bags, each containing what they announced was approximately 1 kilogram of cocaine, discovered in a locked cabinet in the back room of the shop. Jaden was handcuffed in front of his customers, in front of the men who came to his shop every week, in front of the grandmother who had co-signed his loan, and who stood on the sidewalk with her hand pressed against her chest and tears running down her face. The charges were fabricated. The drugs were planted. The method was identical to what had been done to Solomon. But for Jaden, there was no crowd of supporters, no national media, no political allies to call. He was 22 years old, black, running a barbershop on the south side of town, and he was being charged with possession with intent to distribute 2 kilograms of cocaine. Judge Gerald Overton denied bail. Jaden was locked in the county jail. The key witness, the man whose recordings could bring down the entire network, was sitting in a cell. The following morning at 6 a.m., 8 officers in tactical gear arrived at the Greer family home with a search warrant signed by Judge Gerald Overton. Solomon opened the front door in his pajamas. The officers pushed past him without a word. They spread through the house like water, finding every crack. Josephine was pulled from their bed. She stood in the hallway in her nightgown, arms wrapped around herself, while officers opened every cabinet, every drawer, every closet in their home. Harmony appeared in her bedroom doorway and watched as an officer dumped the contents of her dresser drawers onto the floor, his gloved hands sorting through a 12-year-old girl's clothing, her socks, her pajamas, her school uniform, as if contraband might be hidden in the folds of a child's cotton shirt. Solomon stood in the living room and watched his wife weep. He watched his daughter retreat into herself, her eyes going flat and distant in a way that he recognized because he had seen it in the eyes of every witness he had ever represented, the look of a person learning in real time that the system they were told would protect them was the system destroying them. The officers spent 90 minutes in the house. They discovered a bag of heroin concealed beneath the kitchen sink behind the pipes in a space that Solomon and Josephine had never opened in the 4 years they had lived in the home. They discovered an unregistered firearm wrapped in a cloth behind the water heater in the basement, in a corner so deep and so cluttered that Solomon could not have reached it without moving 3 storage boxes and a broken exercise bike. The officers announced their findings with the volume and theatricality of men performing for the body cameras mounted on their chests. Solomon watched. Josephine wept. Harmony stared at the wall. Something inside Solomon cracked. Not broke, cracked. The difference is important. A thing that breaks falls apart. A thing that cracks opens. And in the opening, Solomon could see something he had not been able to see before. He could see the end of this fight. Not his defeat. Their defeat. Because what the officers in tactical gear did not know, what Chief Lassiter did not know, what Judge Overton did not know, what Wade Kirkland did not know, was that 3 days earlier, Solomon's attorney had arranged for the installation of a hidden security camera system throughout the Greer home. Small wireless high-definition cameras placed in the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, the basement, and every bedroom, recording continuously to a cloud server hosted 200 miles away in an Atlanta data center. Every second of the raid was captured. Every planted item was documented. Every officer's face badge number and action was recorded with devastating clarity. The heroin placed under the sink, the firearm placed behind the water heater, the hands that carried them in, the mouths that announced their discovery. All of it was stored on a server that no search warrant signed by Gerald Overton could reach. The very evidence they planted had become evidence against them. Solomon Greer had never felt smaller than he did in the 48 hours after the raid on his home. He was now publicly accused of drug possession for the 2nd time. The fabricated firearm added potential felony weapons charges. His attorney filed emergency motions to suppress the evidence, but the motions went to Judge Overton's court, and the outcome was a foregone conclusion. National media coverage split along predictable lines. One half of the country's commentators saw a corrupt politician whose carefully constructed public image was disintegrating under the weight of his own criminal behavior. They pointed to the drugs found at City Hall. They pointed to the drugs and the gun found in his home. They asked what kind of man brings narcotics into the same house where his 12-year-old daughter sleeps. They called for his immediate resignation and arrest. The other half saw something different. They saw a black man elected to office in a southern city being systematically destroyed by the very institutions he had tried to reform. They saw the pattern. They saw the playbook. They saw a machine designed to grind down anyone who threatened its power, and they recognized that machine because they had seen it operate in city after city, decade after decade, generation after generation. Solomon received a phone call from his mother, Alma, on a Thursday evening. She was calling from her apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she had lived alone since Solomon's father passed away 11 years ago. Her voice was thin and trembling, and carried the particular weight of a mother watching her child walk toward a fire she cannot put out. She begged him to resign. She told him no political office was worth his family's safety. She told him about his father. His father had fought battles like this in the 70s, taking on a local housing authority that was systematically denying black families access to public housing. He won the legal battle. He lost everything else: his practice, his health. His marriage nearly crumbled. He spent the last years of his life sitting in a recliner in a dim living room, a man who had traded everything he had for a victory that the system quietly reversed within 5 years of his death. Alma told Solomon she would not watch the same thing happen to her son. She was weeping now. Solomon listened. He held the phone against his ear and closed his eyes and felt the pull of her words like gravity. The pull toward surrender, toward safety, toward the quiet life that would be waiting for him if he simply walked away from the fire and let the men who built it warm themselves beside it for another generation. He almost broke. He was standing at the edge, and the ground beneath him was crumbling, and the fall looked almost peaceful. Then Josephine spoke. She was standing in the doorway of their bedroom. She had not been eavesdropping. She had simply been there the way she had been there for every moment of this fight, quiet and steady and present. She waited until he hung up the phone. Then she sat beside him on the bed and spoke in a voice so calm it sounded like a woman who had already made peace with whatever was coming. She told him that if he resigned, every black business owner who had been shaken down for 15 years would remain trapped. Every young man like Jaden Colson, who had been extorted and jailed on fabricated charges, would remain voiceless. Every family that had lived in fear of a knock on the door would go on living in that fear until their children grew up afraid of the same knock. She told him she did not marry a man who runs. She married a man who fights. Solomon looked at his wife. He saw the fear in her eyes and the steel beneath it. He made his decision. The next morning he drove to Atlanta. He parked in the underground garage of the federal building on Spring Street and rode the elevator to the 7th floor. He sat in a conference room across from Raymond Oakes, a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Oakes was 48 years old, African-American, with the build of a former college linebacker and the eyes of a man who had spent 2 decades prosecuting the cases that local jurisdictions refused to touch. Solomon laid everything on the table. The hidden camera footage from his home showing officers planting heroin under the sink and a firearm behind the water heater. Jaden Colson's phone recordings, including the conversation in which Kirkland and Lassiter explicitly discussed their racial motivations, and the drug planting plan. Kennedy Ferris's documentation of 5 years of evidence room theft. Financial records tracing the flow of extortion payments through shell accounts. The leaked Lassiter memorandum, ordering the suppression of the internal investigation. Oakes watched the footage on a laptop screen. He listened to the recordings through headphones, his expression unchanging. He read the documents page by page. When he finished, he removed the headphones and set them on the table and looked at Solomon. He told him that in 20 years of prosecuting civil rights cases, this was one of the most comprehensive records of systemic corruption and racial targeting he had ever seen. He told Solomon the federal government was opening an investigation immediately. That same week, Kennedy Ferris published the first installment of an investigative series in the Alden Creek Herald. The article was 1,200 words long and focused exclusively on the evidence room discrepancies. She documented every missing item with dates, case numbers, and the names of the officers on duty when the items disappeared. She did not mention the recordings. She did not mention the hidden cameras. She did not mention Jaden Colson. She published only what she could prove through public records, and she published it with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor 1 layer at a time. The article was picked up by the Associated Press and reprinted in newspapers across the country. But as the federal investigation expanded, agents discovered something that even Solomon had not anticipated. The corruption extended far beyond the police department. Judge Gerald Overton had been issuing warrants and dismissing cases to protect the network for over a decade. District Attorney Franklin Mott had been burying complaints and blocking prosecutions filed against officers in the network. A web of local business owners had profited from the racket receiving favorable treatment and reduced competition in exchange for political support and campaign contributions. The operation had extracted an estimated $4 million from the black community of Alden Creek over 15 years. What had started as one corrupt officer handcuffing a mayor had exposed a generational machine of racial exploitation embedded in every level of the city's power structure, from the patrol car to the courtroom to the ballot box. Federal prosecutors worked in silence for 3 weeks. They did not announce the investigation publicly. They did not issue statements. They did not contact local officials. They operated the way water operates when it finds a crack in a foundation invisible patient and unstoppable. Wiretaps were authorized by a federal judge in Atlanta. Financial records were subpoenaed from 14 different banks, including 3 accounts held in the names of shell companies that existed only on paper. Witnesses from the black community of Alden Creek began coming forward in numbers that surprised even the federal agents. First, it was a trickle. A retired schoolteacher named Gladys, who had paid $250 a month for 3 years after officers threatened to arrest her grandson on drug charges they both knew were invented. A mechanic named Terrence, who had been forced to service police vehicles for free or face weekly inspections that would shut his shop down. A single mother named Brenda, who had been arrested on a fabricated shoplifting charge and spent 4 nights in county jail because she could not afford bail, only to have the charges dropped the morning she made her first contribution to the community partnership fund that did not exist. Then the trickle became a current. Then the current became a flood. Decades of silence broke open. People who had been afraid for years found their voices in the knowledge that the men who had terrorized them were now the ones being watched. The federal agents recorded every testimony with the meticulous care of archivists preserving a history that had never been written down. On a quiet Tuesday morning in October, the sweep began. At 6 a.m., FBI agents arrived at the home of Wade Kirkland. He was still asleep. They knocked once. They announced themselves. They entered with a federal warrant and found him in his bed, tangled in sheets, his eyes blinking against the flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of his bedroom. They pulled him from his bed. They placed him face down on the hardwood floor of his own hallway. They locked his wrists in handcuffs behind his back. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. Simultaneously, agents arrested Police Chief Conrad Lassiter at the Alden Creek Police Station. He was in his office drinking coffee, reviewing a memo he would never send. The agents walked through the bullpen, past officers who stared in stunned silence, opened his office door, and read him his rights in front of the photograph of himself, shaking hands with the governor that hung on the wall behind his desk. Judge Gerald Overton was taken from his chambers at the county courthouse at 6:22 a.m. He was wearing his robe. He had been preparing for the morning docket. When the agents entered, he stood up from his chair and said nothing. He held out his wrists. He knew. District Attorney Franklin Mott was arrested at his office at 6:31 a.m. He attempted to make a phone call before the agents reached him. The call was to a number that had already been disconnected because the person on the other end had been arrested 9 minutes earlier. 7 other officers were arrested throughout the morning at their homes, in their cars, and at the police station. Each arrest was executed with the calm, professional efficiency of an operation that had been planned down to the second. By noon, 11 men were in federal custody. Jaden Colson was released from county jail at 12:17 p.m. He walked through the heavy steel door into sunlight so bright it made his eyes water. His grandmother was standing on the sidewalk. She did not speak. She simply opened her arms and held him while he pressed his face into her shoulder and shook. Solomon held a press conference at City Hall at 2 o'clock that afternoon. He stood at a portable podium placed on the exact spot of pavement where Wade Kirkland had forced him to the ground months earlier. He did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He spoke quietly, with the measured cadence of a man who had walked through fire and emerged not triumphant, but transformed. He spoke about justice. He spoke about the generations of black families in Alden Creek who had suffered in silence, who had paid money they could not afford to men who swore an oath to protect them, who had watched their children learn to fear the very uniforms that were supposed to mean safety. He spoke about the cost of fighting and the greater cost of surrender. Josephine stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Harmony stood on his other side, 14 months older than the girl who had watched her father, handcuffed from the front row of a Founder's Day celebration. And something in her eyes had changed. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Something that looked like her father. Reverend Chambliss stood behind Solomon, his Bible in his hand, his eyes closed. Nora Poindexter stood at the edge of the stage, her arms folded, her chin raised. Kennedy Ferris watched from the press area, her notebook closed for the first time in months. The work was done. The community filled the streets that evening. Black business owners who had paid extortion money for years stood in the doorways of their shops and embraced customers and strangers alike. An elderly barber on 7th Street hung a hand-painted sign in his window that read, "Open and free." Young people who had grown up understanding that the police were not there to protect them, but to control them, stood together on corners and sidewalks, stunned and uncertain, as if the air itself tasted different, and they were still learning how to breathe it. But the day was not over. In the hours before his arrest, Wade Kirkland had executed one final act of destruction. He had mailed a package to every major media outlet in the state of Georgia. The package contained a set of documents alleging that Mayor Solomon Greer had been embezzling city funds through a shell company and conducting an extramarital affair with a member of his own staff. The documents were detailed, convincing, and completely fabricated. They landed in newsrooms at the worst possible moment, just as the story of the federal arrests was breaking, and for 12 agonizing hours, the narrative fractured. Cable news anchors asked the question, was the mayor a hero or a hypocrite? Was this a story of justice or a house of cards? Solomon sat in his study that night and watched the coverage and felt the ground shifting beneath him. Again, felt the familiar vertigo of a man who cannot find solid footing because the people trying to destroy him keep moving the floor. But Kennedy Ferris was already working. She coordinated with federal investigators who had seized Kirkland's personal computer during the morning raid. Digital forensics traced the fabricated documents to a printer registered to Kirkland's home address. Metadata embedded in the files showed they had been created over a 72-hour period, the week before the arrests. Kennedy published her findings at 11 p.m. that night in a special online edition of the Alden Creek Herald. By morning, every outlet that had run the allegations issued a retraction. Kirkland's last weapon shattered in his hands. The federal trial took place in a courtroom in Atlanta on a gray November morning when the trees along Peachtree Street had already dropped most of their leaves, and the wind carried the first real chill of the season through the city. Solomon Greer sat in the gallery with Josephine on one side and Harmony on the other, and watched as 12 jurors, 7 women, and 5 men took their seats in the box. The evidence was overwhelming. It arrived in waves, each one larger than the last, each one more devastating than the one before it. The hidden camera footage from the Greer home played on a large screen mounted on the courtroom wall. The jury watched officers in tactical gear move through the home. They watched gloved hands place a bag of heroin beneath the kitchen sink. They watched a different pair of gloved hands slide an unregistered firearm behind the water heater in the basement. They watched the same officers step back and discover the items they had just planted, announcing their findings with the rehearsed surprise of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. Jaden Colson's recordings filled the courtroom through speakers mounted in the ceiling. Kirkland's voice was unmistakable, flat and casual, discussing the need to keep the black community in line, to remind them who ran this city, to put the mayor back where he belonged. Lassiter's voice answered, agreeing, elaborating, refining the plan with the calm efficiency of a man discussing a budget revision rather than the destruction of another human being's life. Kennedy Ferris's investigative documentation was entered into the record. Spreadsheets and evidence logs and chain of custody forms that told the story of a department systematically looting its own evidence room to fuel an extortion operation that had targeted exclusively black residents and black-owned businesses for 15 years. Witness after witness took the stand. Gladys, the retired schoolteacher, described the monthly payments she made to avoid the arrest of a grandson who had never committed a crime. Terrence the mechanic described being forced to repair patrol cars without compensation under threat of fabricated violations. Brenda, the single mother, described spending 4 nights in jail on charges that evaporated the moment she started paying. Jaden Colson testified for 3 hours. He described the fear of operating a business under the constant threat of men who wore badges and carried guns and could end his livelihood with a phone call. He described the recording setup in his barbershop. He described the moment he decided to approach the mayor in a grocery store parking lot because he had reached the point where living in fear was more unbearable than the risk of fighting back. The defense attorneys argued procedure. They argued context. They argued that their clients were dedicated public servants caught in a politically motivated witch hunt orchestrated by a mayor desperate to distract from his own legal troubles. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on every count. Wade Kirkland was convicted of conspiracy civil rights violations under federal statute, racketeering evidence, tampering, and obstruction of justice. The same charges applied to Conrad Lassiter, Gerald Overton, Franklin Mott, and 9 other officers and officials. Sentences ranged from 12 to 35 years in federal prison. Kirkland received 35. Lassiter received 30. The courtroom was silent when the sentences were read. No cheering. No outbursts. The silence itself was the sound of something shifting, the sound of a weight being lifted from a community that had carried it so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. In the months that followed, Solomon implemented the reforms he had promised on the day he was elected. A civilian police oversight board was established, staffed by community members with real investigative authority and subpoena power. Every officer in the department underwent new training focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and constitutional policing. The department was restructured from command level down, with new leadership recruited from outside the existing power network. Body cameras became mandatory, with footage stored on independent servers that could not be accessed or altered by department personnel. An independent audit of every arrest and conviction connected to the corrupt officers over the previous 15 years led to the review of over 600 cases. 147 convictions were overturned. 11 people were released from prison, some of whom had served years behind bars for crimes that had never occurred. 2 years after the Founders' Day handcuffing, Solomon Greer stood on the stage at City Hall Plaza on a warm evening in June and accepted the results of his re-election. He won by 9,412 votes, a margin so wide it was not a victory so much as a verdict. Josephine stood beside him, holding his hand, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who had watched her husband crawl through fire and emerge not unburned, but unbroken. Harmony, now 14, stood on his other side, holding a sign she had made herself with markers and poster board. The sign read, "Justice lives here." The crowd that filled the plaza was 3 times the size of the one that had witnessed his handcuffing. They cheered, they wept, they held each other. And then something happened that no one expected. At Wade Kirkland's sentencing hearing 6 weeks after the verdicts, the courtroom in Atlanta was packed to capacity. Federal marshals lined the walls. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Solomon sat in the 2nd row with Josephine and Nora and Reverend Chambliss. Kennedy Ferris sat in the press section with her notebook open. The judge was preparing to formally pronounce the sentence when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The room turned. A 71-year-old white woman walked slowly down the center aisle. She was small, thin, her white hair pulled back from her face, her hands gripping the strap of a worn leather handbag. She walked with the careful, deliberate steps of a person who had been rehearsing this moment for years, without knowing when it would arrive. It was Dorothy Kirkland, Wade's mother, the widow of Captain Virgil Kirkland. Wade saw her, and his face changed. The defiance that had hardened his expression throughout the trial cracked. His lips parted, his eyes widened. He had not expected her. Dorothy approached the bench and asked permission to address the court. The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Dorothy turned to face the courtroom. Her hands trembled as she reached into her handbag and removed a leather journal brown and cracked with age. Its pages yellowed its spine, held together with a rubber band. She held it up for the courtroom to see. She said that this journal belonged to her husband, Virgil Kirkland, who served as captain of the Alden Creek Police Department for 30 years. She said that in this journal written in his own hand, Virgil documented every corrupt act he committed, every business he shook down, every dollar he stole, every life he ruined, every lie he told, going back to the very first year he built the operation. She said he kept the journal because the guilt consumed him. He could not stop what he had started. The machine was too big, and too many people depended on it, and too many powerful men were invested in its survival. But he could not pretend it did not exist. So he wrote it down. Every name, every amount, every date, every act. He wrote it the way a man writes a confession he is too afraid to speak aloud. He died with this journal hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer, and Dorothy found it the day after his funeral. She had kept it for years. She told this courtroom she kept it because she was waiting for someone with the courage to tear down what her husband built, waiting for someone strong enough to stand in the fire and refuse to move. She turned away from the judge. She walked directly to Solomon Greer. She stood in front of him, this small white woman in a silent courtroom, and she held out the journal with both hands. She told him that her husband died, knowing exactly what he was, and she would not allow her son to spend the rest of his life pretending he was something different. Solomon took the journal. The leather was warm from her hands. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the rubber band stretching as he opened the cover seemed to fill the entire room. He looked at the first page. The handwriting was small and precise. The first entry was dated 31 years ago. The first name was a barbershop owner on Broad Street. The first amount was $75. And from that first entry, the entire history of a generational machine of racial injustice unfolded across 247 pages, written in the hand of the man who built it, preserved by the wife who could not destroy it, and delivered to the man who tore it down. Wade Kirkland stared at his mother from the defense table. His expression was something the sketch artists would struggle to capture, and the reporters would struggle to describe. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was the look of a man watching the last wall between himself and the truth collapse, and realizing that the truth had been standing behind it the entire time, patient and immovable, waiting for him to stop running. Solomon drove home to Alden Creek that evening with the journal on the passenger seat beside him. The highway stretched south through Georgia, through pine forests, and small towns and gas stations with hand-painted signs. The sun was setting, throwing long golden light across the windshield and warming the cracked leather cover of the journal. His phone rang. It was Josephine. Harmony wanted to know when he would be home for dinner. She was making her father's favorite baked macaroni and cheese from scratch, and she needed to know when to put it in the oven. Solomon smiled. He told them he was on his way. He passed the city limits sign for Alden Creek. The sign was the same green and white rectangle. It had always been the same name, in the same font, on the same metal post. But for the first time in a very long time, the name of his city did not feel like a weight pressing down on his chest. It felt like something he had helped build. Something worth coming home to. Something that, for the first time in a generation, belonged to everyone who lived there. Now here is a question worth thinking about. If the institutions designed to protect us are the same ones causing harm, whose responsibility is it to demand change, and what are we willing to risk to see it through? Take a moment to share your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it too. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Stories like this one are how we keep the conversation alive, and conversations are how the world begins to change. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. May you carry with you the reminder that justice is never given freely. It is built by the hands of those brave enough to demand it, even when the cost is everything they have.